and welcome to Soul Talk with Rabbi David Aaron and Leora Mandel. Rabbi Aaron, today I want to talk to you about Jewish guilt. And the reason why I call it Jewish guilt is I was thinking about the fact that there is this concept. For some reason, as Jews, we often feel guilty. We often think of the mothers laying on Jewish guilt, and it's a thing, putting those two words together. So the truth is, guilt is a big topic as it is, I think, in the world at large, because it's a very heavy burden to carry. We're often trying to sort of examine, should we feel guilty? Should we not feel guilty? How to let go of guilt? But specifically, the idea that there's this connection between the words Jewish guilt. What is guilt? What should Jewish guilt really be? And how do we deal with the burden of guilt that we so often are carrying and really would do sometimes better to let go of?
Right. Well, I often say a little joke before I start my classes to people that don't know me, and I say a little bit about myself, and I say, actually, I did not grow up in a Jewish religious home. I grew up in a very Jewish feeling home because I always felt guilty, so I knew I was Jewish. And I get some good laughs on that, but the question is the fact that you get good laughs on that shows that you really hit something that people resonate, that there is something kind of like Jewish guilt. There's this feeling of guilt. And for a lot of people, Judaism is a guilt trip and not a spiritual journey. And I would say much of my teachings, my writings, my own journey has to kind of liberate myself from doing things from Jewish guilt and doing things from a place of a desire to take a spiritual journey. So, what is that Jewish guilt? Well, first of all, I would like to talk about the good side of it. I mean, guilt is that a person that's guiltless is a very scary, dangerous person. They don't feel any guilt. They don't have a conscience that's saying, hey, that was not the best you could do. In fact, that's really bad. It's conscience, and our conscience is hitting on us and reminding us that we could do better. I think, though, there is a certain energy in some of the Jewish world, at least, of a tremendous amount of ambition for greatness. Ambition for perfection, for excellence. And we feel guilty when we don't live up to when we don't step up to that plate. And that's a dangerous thing. So when guilt is, it's kind of like the light in my car that lets me know that I have a light in my car that lets me know I have a flat tire. So I'm really happy because I wouldn't have known. And sometimes it means the tire is actually low on pressure. So that's a good thing. This light goes off to let you know something's wrong. Guilt should be that light. Now, if I say, I don't like that light, it annoys me, even though I have low pressure in my tire, I'm going to dismantle that light. That's not a good idea because that light is there to help me it's an indicator that something's wrong. But if it's flashing all the time and there is enough air in the tire, that's not a good thing too, and now we're just becoming neurotic. So the question is the guilt, everything has to do with dose. In our tradition, there's something called attributes in Hebrew, midot. And the word midah, which has been translated as a character trait or an attribute, literally means a measure. And what makes it into a good attribute or a bad attribute is the measure. It always has to be just the right amount. The cake needs sugar, but too much sugar will wreck the cake. Not enough sugar will certainly wreck the cake also.
It's such a good example of thinking about those dummy lights. They call them dummy lights on the car. I don't know why they call them that because they're actually such an important warning sign. And you're right. If it's there to warn you and give you a heads up, hey, check in, there might be something you need to fine tune here, fix, change, repair, then that's doing a good job. If it goes off too often, then it's too sensitive. There's something off with it. And just like the car, you can't keep functioning that way, always paying attention to it. I think that's where guilt actually becomes this burden. So that definitely answers to the question of sometimes, yes, I did something wrong and it's actually healthy for me to feel bad and maybe even a little guilty about it because that might help me make a change. But I was thinking that sometimes we feel guilty if we haven't made someone happy or we make a choice that someone else doesn't like or someone we care about is upset with us. And maybe sometimes it's because we did something wrong, but there are so many different kinds of guilt that we have that feeling without it necessarily being that we did something wrong. Why is it that when that's the case, we're still feeling that guilt?
Well, actually, I think we are feeling guilt because we did something wrong, but the problem is we actually didn't do anything wrong. But we're holding ourselves to a standard that's not fair. And, we talked about this before. There's three businesses. There's my business, your business, and God's business. And the problem is we don't mind our own business. There's certain things that this is not my business, and I feel I failed because I stuck my nose in somebody else's business, and I'm trying to own somebody else's business. That's already very dangerous and very, very unhealthy. So I think we need to practice self-compassion, but the self-compassion has to be contextualized within a sense of clarity. Like, is it my responsibility to make them happy? That's a crazy thing. I was speaking to a rabbi and asked him what is the mission of Jewish life, of living a Torah life, and surprisingly, he told me that our goal in life is to make God happy. I don't know where he got that from, but I don't think that's a healthy. I don't see that sourced anywhere. Like God needs me to make him happy. But if a person is living with expectations that are not right or are not balanced or overstated, then they're just causing self guilt. I'm not living up to expectations, and I think that might be part of this Jewish guilt brand because there are really high expectations of ourselves as Jewish people. We are supposed to be a light into the nations, and I think there is a desire for excellence in the Jewish world. I think that's really beautiful, and I think perhaps it might even be the root of some anti-Semitism because we're a minority group, and yet we have excelled in such extraordinary ways beyond the percentage of how much we represent mankind, how much we've done for mankind is extraordinary. And so we do strive for greatness. We do strive for excellence. We do take a lot of responsibility because we've been gifted a lot of responsibility. We just have to be sure that the guilt is motivating us rather than undermining us. Because when you feel guilty, 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 at some point you just say, I can't handle it anymore, and I'm going to stop trying.
Wow, what you just said, we have to make sure that the guilt is motivating us rather than undermining us, is huge because I don't know if most of us have heard of the idea of guilt connected to it helps you feel motivated. But the way you're explaining it, actually, I really see the point. And you actually gave a really good, and I just want to make sure I'm getting this right. I think like as soon as we touch into that feeling of guilt, that heavy, usually it's a heaviness for me. I don't know how anyone else feels, but everyone knows their feeling of guilt. The first question might be to say, did I do something wrong? And examine that. And if so, make a change. But again, it's motivational because the feeling now motivates me to make a change. But if I look into myself and say, I don't think I did anything wrong here, so why am I feeling guilty? Then you gave the next step is, am I in somebody else's business? And then that might answer might possibly be yes, right? I don't want another person to be upset with me, maybe, even though I did nothing wrong, but that's their business if they're going to be upset with me. And as long as I've examined my side of the fence and I'm okay with what I did, I made a choice that was right in the situation, then I should sort of let go of some of that feeling of guilt. Does that process seem to be the way to work it through?
Yeah, yeah. I think it's hard for us to say, I did an honest effort. I was genuine, authentic in my intentions and my effort. And, it's very hard for us to say, I did the best I can, because we always come back to us, well, couldn't I have done better? Could I have done better? And that's where it's hard to practice self-compassion and, kind of lay off, like go easy on yourself that you did an honest effort. You wanted to make somebody happy or you wanted to show somebody kindness. It didn't go out. There's no reason for you to feel guilty. You did your job. You did your effort. You did a good act with good intention, and okay, things didn't turn out the way you wanted it to, but that's not your business. That's in the hands of God already.
So let me ask you a question because I feel like this is one of those cases where there's times where, and this is already a step in my head, I can get to a place of recognizing this, I did what I could and I'm okay with what I did. And it's not there's no reason for me to hold on to this guilt. I should let it go. And yet, sometimes we find the heart doesn't let it go. It just, the heaviness is still there. You gave a really important key, I think, in saying we need to have self-compassion. That's actually a big deal. And I'm sure part of the answer to my question, but I still want to ask it anyhow, because I feel like so many of us might struggle with the idea that even if I'm clear in my head, there's no reason for me to be feeling guilty here. How can we let it go so that we don't carry it still?
Because we have to have the strength to put it back in the hands of God. A person, in our tradition, let's say a person really does something wrong. They admit that they did something wrong. They regret that they did something wrong, and they accept upon themselves never to do it again. But what if what they did wrong has left some consequences that cannot be remedied, you know? So they live with this guilt that everything would have been different had I not made that mistake. And according to Judaism, everything would not have been different. You know, if it happened, it's in God's hands. You made a choice, and you carried out that choice. If you admit the mistake, you regret the mistake, and you accept never to do it again, and you do everything you can to remedy it, but there's certain damage that just cannot be, repaired. That's already in God's hands. If it happened, it happened. And I think part of the guilt is that people are holding on to something that is not in their control anymore. You know, I know my family was in a terrible accident and the guy was negligent in driving and he caused damage to our family. And there are still family members that have been, you know, for a lifetime been handicapped by it. Not severe handicap, but nonetheless, there were consequences to the accident that cannot be changed. And this man, I know he did tshuva, he repented, he came, he apologized, he did everything. And I hope he's not living with guilt that everything would have been different because that's already God's department. You know, everything would have been different. If that's what happened, then that was somehow the plan of God. And, but again, a person has to be very careful because they can use that to say, well, then I don't feel, I don't feel regret by what I did because it was a part of God's plan. We live in these two worlds. When it comes to, we have to take responsibility for the choice. And when we do that, then we are taught that God takes our name off that event and puts his name on it.
Wow. I'm definitely feeling, not just hearing, that the perspective you're sharing is so powerful as far as being able to not live with those heavy feelings of guilt and also resentment. Meaning, you're showing me that a whole perspective of how you see life and how you understand God and the world and the Jewish perspective can make the biggest difference between living a life filled with constant either guilt or resentment potentially or anger versus
Yeah.
the capacity to really put that down when you really have the understanding that God's running the show. It's such a fine nuance. We're responsible for our actions, and at the same time, things that happen, it's in God's hands. And I know we've spoken about this before, and you've explained it very well. So we have other shows talking more specifically about this, but it does tie in here very significantly and shows the perspective that we have can make the biggest difference of constantly carrying guilt around versus being able to do our due diligence, do our part, but then be able to let it rest and continue to walking on in life in a healthier way.
Right. Look, if I were to see this guy, I haven't seen him since that accident. If I were to see this guy, I'd give him a hug. I feel zero resentment, zero anger towards him. He came, he apologized. I believe he was authentic in his apology. He knows the mistake he made. He did everything he can to remedy it. And then the rest is God's business, not his or mine.
So, there's so much of this conversation already has, at least for me, and I'd imagine our listeners, has really turned things on its head. Even the idea that guilt can be motivational, the idea that our whole perspective and how we even understand the purpose and the point and the productivity of guilt can also completely change its experience from being something very heavy and unwanted to something that actually potentially can free us up to become better, but it doesn't have to weigh us down. You mentioned that specifically again, you even started with the joke of the concept of Jewish guilt likely comes from this desire for excellence. And I just find it so interesting because in a certain way, just like we sometimes I think offhand that guilt is bad, but you're showing us not necessarily. We think the desire of excellence can be a very good thing. And yet, in a sense, that might be the challenge of why this negative form of guilt is connected to it. So again, it goes back to this question of how do we find the healthy balance in each of these sides?
Well, you know what? I think it'll go back to excellence because I once realized that maybe you didn't fail at what you did, but you failed in your definition of success. I think sometimes our failing is that we've failed at defining a better success or a more genuine success. And so I think the problem is that if people are feeling guilty that they didn't accomplish what is excellent, maybe they've got the wrong definition of excellence. Maybe the excellence they should have focused on was their family relationship, so the business didn't work out, but they didn't sacrifice their kids for it. It's, things are a lot more complex and nuanced. They're not black and white, but it goes back to balance. It's just guilt's a good thing, but not too much and not too little.
You know what you're really, really showing me is that if any of us listening are a person who tends to carry guilt, we really have to go back to certain fundamental belief systems that we may not even be very conscious of, but seeing how they play out. Because every time you undo that heaviness of the guilt, it comes down to a certain belief system. And the way you're explaining the thinking process, it releases the heaviness of guilt. And I think the way that so many people might be carrying it, holding on to it, and feeling suffocating by it, it really comes down to you need to examine real fundamental beliefs. And a change in belief system can also have a significant effect on the way we feel and experience this emotion.
Yeah, our life is not make belief, but made of beliefs. So it's not a life of make belief, it's a life that's made of beliefs. And really, it's the beliefs that are determining the quality of your life.
And this is such a powerful example, just this short conversation, to realize the significant difference that a belief has. And it's interesting because what I first asked you was sometimes in our head we're clear that I shouldn't be holding on to the guilt, but emotionally it's hard to let go. And yet at the same time, the emotion is so connected to a thought process. So but this is, I think, a deeper thought process because there's a thought process of there's no reason for me to carry guilt in this situation. I did nothing wrong. But I have to go even deeper than that is what is the belief system that's holding this emotion inside of me? And if I can call it out, see it, and change it, and you've given some very powerful, and as you're saying, Torah true beliefs that really free us from this guilt, it almost makes it seem even more ironic that the concept of Jewish guilt is out there because far from a Jewish concept, the way you're explaining it, that kind of guilt is not really Jewish. So I really want to thank you because I have a feeling for so many of us, for myself definitely, it really reframes the whole concept of guilt. It totally turns everything on its head, even the concept of Jewish guilt. Just know out there, Jewish guilt is actually not really a Jewish concept if you really understand what Rabbi Aaron is sharing here. It's so different. And far from bringing something negative and something we want to try to get rid of, recognize it has a certain positive power. That's what we want to tap into and recognize when we have the right belief systems, it can be transformative. I want to thank you all for joining us, Soul Talk, Rabbi David Aaron and Leora Mandel.
Thank you.